All right, can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, cool. So I wanted to put this meeting together today as an introduction to Active Directory. Active Directory is a really important thing to know for pretty much any technical field that you're going to go into, whether it be IT or software development or cybersecurity. Active Directory is going to come up in all of those. And so it's really important that we understand it. I'm going to try to teach you guys what I feel are the most important parts of the basics. To teach you everything in an hour would be an insane thing to try to do, and it's probably not possible. But we're going to try to learn as much as we can. Like I always say with my meetings, the stuff I present on, I'm very comfortable with, and I've been dealing with it for years at this point. So what makes sense to me might not make sense to you. If you have any questions, I mean, there aren't a lot of us here, so you could just unmute yourself and ask, or you could type it in the chat, and someone will see it. But yeah, I encourage you to ask questions if there's something that you don't understand. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to start off with what is Active Directory. Active Directory at a high level is a directory service that's developed by Microsoft. It's used to manage things like users, computers, printers, etc., all across the network. It provides centralized authentication and authorization mechanisms for historically Windows-based computers and applications, although more recently you can also integrate Linux systems into that. And really, as long as you know what you're doing, you can make any software work with Active Directory for the most part. Within an Active Directory environment, information is stored in a hierarchical structure that we often refer to as forests. We're going to get into what that means in a little bit. You can also use Active Directory to define policies and manage security and distribute software and updates to all the computers across the entire network. Most commonly, you're going to see Active Directory in enterprise environments, specifically because of the reason that I just mentioned. It basically keeps everything centralized and organized. It makes it really easy to manage resources efficiently and to make sure everyone has access to what they need to do their job. It's estimated that close to 95% of Fortune 500 companies use Active Directory. And that's probably because Microsoft has close to a complete monopoly in the directory services space. There are other directory services that exist, but none of them even come close to what Active Directory has become over time. And a more recent thing with Active Directory is that in the past, it obviously started out only supporting on-prem environments, and then more recently, it also supports cloud environments now. So Active Directory really isn't going anywhere for a long time. Because of this, it becomes a primary target for attackers. And as security professionals, or even if you're not in security, it's important that you understand how Active Directory works. So we're going to start with the fundamentals. We're going to talk about the structure, and we're going to talk about what AD objects are. And these kind of make up the base of Active Directory. So when we talk about what Active Directory is, like I said, a directory service. Directory services give organizations a way to store directory data and make it available to users across an entire network. Like I was saying before, it's arranged in a hierarchical structure that we like to call forests. The analogy makes it really easy to remember once you understand it. So I'm going to very quickly run through it and then we're going to break it down. At the highest level, you have forests, which contain several trees or domains. Each tree can contain one or more branches, which are also or subdomains. And every branch can contain its own leaves, which are the AD objects within that domain. So to break that down a little more, a domain is a structure within which you can basically contain AD objects. We'll get into what AD objects are in a little bit. So I have an example tree here. So a forest, like I said, is composed of multiple different trees or domains. The tree is what's referred to as the root domain or the highest level domain in the environment. So in this example, the name of the tree is Gotham.io. It is the highest level domain in the environment, and everything else is a child of this domain. Within Gotham.io, we have several branches. We have admin.gotham.io, we have corp.gotham.io, and we have dev.gotham.io. Those are all subdomains of the Gotham.io domain, or they are branches of the Gotham.io tree. Each of these branches could also theoretically contain more branches or more subdomains, and it can basically go as deep as you want it to. Each branch, like I said before, can also contain several leaves. These are the Active Directory objects that are stored within the domain, so like group policy and organizational units and users and computers and all that good stuff. Before I continue, does what I've said so far make sense to everyone? Because the next slide is going to build on all this.
Yep.
Yeah, Jake, you raised your hand. What's your question?
No, I was trying to put my thumbs up. Don't worry about me.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, I thought you had a question. Okay, cool. So the other key part of Active Directory structure is trusts. Now, previously we only looked at a single tree, and I said that forests contain multiple trees. These trees become a forest when they are linked together by these trusts. So trusts are a way of linking one or more already existing trees together. You commonly see trusts in organizations that perform a lot of acquisitions. And the reason for this is because it is significantly easier to just create a domain trust than it is to actually rebuild an entire domain as a subdomain of your domain. So, for example, if Gotham.io here acquired Metropolis.local and they didn't want to use a domain trust, they would then need to take all of Metropolis.local and all of these subdomains and all of the objects within it and rebuild it all as a subdomain of Gotham.io. And there could be hundreds of thousands of objects within this Metropolis.local domain that they would then have to go through and recreate. And it would take a very, very long time, and it's not really worth the effort. So instead, you would create what's called a trust, and that links the two domains together. There are a couple different kinds of trusts. We're not going to get into them right now because they get really, really complicated really quickly. But what you need to know at a base level is that trusts are a way of linking um, one or more domains together. Um, then we also have Active Directory objects. At the simplest level, objects are basically any resource that's present within the Active Directory environment. So, like users, computers, printers, servers, all of that good stuff. You also have something called organizational units or OUs. And these are ways of kind of grouping together different objects. So if we go back to here, some of the OUs in this admin.gotham.io domain, you have an OU for employees, and within that organizational unit, you have an OU for computers, and then that would contain all the computer objects, and then you would have an OU for groups, and that would contain all of the group objects, and same for users. And you could make this as granular as you want. You could go down to pretty much every detail if you wanted to. So I think Raymond wanted to talk a little bit about his experience with Active Directory so far. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Raymond, if he's still here.
Yep, I am still here, David.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so just talking about Active Directory, I think David's been doing a wonderful job so far, just talking about the importance of it, how, it functions at like the most fundamental levels, the most basic levels of it. But all that is really tied together into when you start talking about like your actual hands-on experience with AD. You can learn about all the different functions of AD, and as David said, it's hard to learn about all that in a 1 hour meeting. But when you start working with it, like during an internship, for example, or even on job, that's when you really start to kind of grasp all of the details. So for my internship with Major League Baseball, when I was going through the original internship during the summer, the Active Directory was the one thing that gave me the most trouble because, it is something that comes so naturally to people that work there because they get used to how, they build out their users, how they, put computers in certain OUs. Everything of that nature, how they operate under domain controllers, for example, and the different groups within the company. So when you start your internship, whether that be an IT role or, any cybersecurity role, it's always good to be asking questions about Active Directory because this is what runs the company at a technology level. This is how users get onto the network. This is how computers are stored on the network. So it's always good to be curious. Go up to whoever is either working with this the most. If you hear them always talking about Active Directory, and I trust you, if you're working at help desk, you're probably going to hear Active Directory at least once a day, if not more. Definitely, probably more. Um, but yeah, just always be curious about this because when you're on the job, this is going to come up for sure. If we go back, for example, with David talking about, 95% of the Fortune 500 companies use AD, this is almost an inescapable thing. Windows does have this massive monopoly on directory services. So again, just make sure that you try to soak in as much information from this presentation as possible and don't be afraid to ask questions when you finally get into that, IT role or that cybersecurity role. Last thing that I wanted to mention too was I really love the slide about the mergers and bidirectional trust for domains because that was a part of the thing that really gave me trouble. Yeah, right here on the slide for MLB, there was a bunch of different offices that they merged into one. And under that, they also decided to do what this is, bidirectional trust. Instead of building out a whole new, or integrating everything from, one building and how they operated their IT staff, they implemented this. And so everyone would just be like, oh yeah, this computer is under this domain. This user is part of the MLB domain rather than the MLBAM. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So people will always just like kind of think that, the language that they speak because they've been in the company for so long won't be the language that you speak as an intern or starting off with the company. So that's why it's always good to ask questions and just try to understand how things are built out. That's all I wanted to add for this. David, you can continue going. Wonderful presentation so far.
Um, all right, that was awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I think your point about the language you speak is actually very important. When it comes to technology, pretty much every organization is going to speak a different language, so to say. Every organization has their own way of doing things, and they have different procedures and all that. And so, like Raymond said, it's important to ask questions and familiarize with yourself with everything. All right, so with that, we're going to move into talking about the different protocols that rest at the heart of Active Directory. Some of these can get a little bit complicated, so again, I encourage you to ask questions if there's anything that doesn't make sense to you. And so let's jump into it. So the very first protocol we're going to talk about is Kerberos. Kerberos is the default authentication protocol in Active Directory environments. Originally, the default protocol for authentication was NTLM. That is now a legacy protocol. Kerberos is default now. Kerberos provides what's called mutual authentication, which means both the server and the user have to verify their identity. And Kerberos makes use of a ticket system instead of using passwords. And we'll get into what that means in a minute. I also just want to explain a term really quick that's going to come up a lot when we talk about Kerberos, and that is the KDC. The KDC is the Key Distribution Center, which is the part of the domain controller that is responsible for issuing tickets. So how does Kerberos work? So when a user logs onto a computer, their password gets converted into an NTLM hash, and that's how their password is stored. It's very bad practice to store passwords in clear text, and so usually you store a hash of the password, and then when a user logs in, the password that they enter is hashed and compared to the one that's stored, and if the hash is matched, then they put in the right password. So when a user logs in, that password is converted into an NTLM hash, and that hash is used to encrypt a request that gets sent to the KDC. This request is called a TGT request, and this is the user asking for what's called a TGT, or a ticket granting ticket. This ticket basically is going to be used going forward to verify the user's identity. So when the KDC receives this encrypted request, since the KDC is part of the domain controller, it has access to the user's password, and so it will hash their password, or actually it'll just take their password hash because it doesn't store the clear text password, and it will try to use that to decrypt the request. If it can decrypt the request, then the user has successfully verified their identity, and the KDC will create a TGT, a ticket granting ticket, encrypt it with the user's password hash, and then send it back to the user. Something that's very important about this is the reason that Kerberos was implemented is because it's a way to not need to send passwords or password hashes over the network. And the reason that's so important is because there are various techniques. Obviously, if someone's listening and sniffing the traffic, and you send a password, that's bad news. But even if you send a password hash over the network, there are various techniques to leverage that to give an attacker more access. And so you kind of just want to avoid sending any form of credentials over the network. And so instead, Kerberos uses these tickets. So once the user has their TGT, they're good, they're logged in. Now that user wants to access some service on the network. For example, they might want to access like a SQL database. When they go to access that service, they're going to present their TGT to the domain controller and request what's called a TGS for that specific service. A TGS is a ticket granting service ticket. If the now, if you remember, the TGT is encrypted with the user's NTLM password hash. And so the domain controller will try to decrypt the TGT using the user's password hash. If they can, if the domain controller can decrypt it, then again, the user's identity has been verified. And so the domain controller will create a TGS. And this time the ticket is encrypted with the service's NTLM hash. And when we get into users and stuff, we're going to talk about how most services have a user account in an Active Directory domain, or a service account, not really a user account. But the domain controller will encrypt that TGS with the service's NTLM hash. And then it will send the TGS to the user. And then finally, the user can present the TGS, not the TGT. I made a mistake there. The user will present that TGS to the service. And if the service can decrypt it using its own password hash, it will grant the user access to the service. So that's a little complicated. Are there any questions about that? Jake, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask one question. So I know you mentioned that you wouldn't want to send any sort of credentials over the network, right?
Yeah.
In the communications. But what's stopping someone from just like acquiring someone else's TGT and then them using that to acquire whatever services they want?
You can technically acquire a TGT for another user. It's a little harder to extract them. They also have some of their own user verification methods that also get a little complicated and are a little more than what I want to get into here. But yes, you're absolutely right. You can leverage tickets for access as well, and there are actually a lot of methods of doing so, such as golden tickets or diamond tickets and silver tickets, which are all ways of basically just abusing the way Kerberos works to gain more access to the environment.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, Raymond.
I think one of the beauties of tech is that we have so much underlying processes and protocols that happen on the back end. But like for a user, for example, who's just trying to access their timesheet, for example, that's tied to this Active Directory, how seamless is this process for the user?
I mean, the user's not going to see any of this happening. Most people who don't work in tech have no idea that any of this actually goes on, which kind of just speaks to the amount of work that's gone into these things to make them work so seamlessly. It's something I say very often, is that the reason most of my security research tends to be in Windows environments is because I find Windows as a whole to be a fascinatingly complex operating system. And yeah, you would have no idea about half the things that go on, more than half. But yeah. Okay, so we're all clear on. I'm just gonna check one more time. We're all clear on Kerberos. Makes sense to everyone? Okay, cool. So the second protocol we're going to talk about is DNS. I'm sure most of you know what DNS is in the context of the internet. DNS, it refers to domain name services. It's how you can type something like google.com into the search bar of your browser, and you actually get sent to the proper server. This is used within Active Directory environments to allow different clients or services to talk to the domain controller, and for the domain controllers to speak to each other. The third protocol we're going to talk about is LDAP. LDAP is very important. It's basically the heart of Active Directory. Anything you can do within an Active Directory environment, you can do through raw LDAP queries. And generally, that's how most tools work with Active Directory. You might tell your tool to do something, and on the back end, it's going to convert that task into an LDAP query and then query the domain. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It's used for authentication as well as a bunch of other things against various directory services. Like I was just saying, it's the language that applications use to communicate with directory services. The relationship between Active Directory and LDAP can be kind of like compared to the relationship between Apache and HTTP. Just like Apache is a web server that uses the HTTP protocol. Active Directory is a directory service that uses the LDAP protocol. So little diagram just illustrating what I was saying. You might be using whatever application and it may need some user information. So it will convert that request to an LDAP query. It'll use that query to query the domain. It'll take the response and then it will return that information to the application. The other big thing with LDAP is authentication. There are really two kinds of LDAP authentication. You have simple authentication, which is basically just like basic authentication, username, password. You can do anonymous authentication, all the usual stuff. And then there's also what's called SASL authentication, which stands for Simple Authentication and Security Layer framework. This uses other authentication services such as Kerberos. So, for example, it will allow you to do Kerberos authentications through LDAP, where you would initially try to authenticate somewhere, and then on the back end, the LDAP server is going to use LDAP to send a bunch of messages back and forth between the required authentication protocol. And eventually that'll result in either successful or unsuccessful authentication. We're not going to get into exactly how it works, although it is pretty interesting if you want to research it a little more. The third, is this third or fourth? I don't remember. I think this is, I don't know. I think this is whatever. The fourth protocol we're going to talk about is MSRPC. This is Microsoft's implementation of remote procedure calls, or RPC. RPC is a way for processes to communicate with each other. Basically, there are four key RPC interfaces that MSRPC implements. First, you have LSA RPC, which is a set of RPC calls that can be used to talk to the local security authority, or LSA. LSA manages the local security policy on a computer. It controls the audit policy. It provides authentication services. And you can use LSA RPC to perform management on domain security policies. The next interface is NetLogon. NetLogon is a Windows process that's used to authenticate users and other services in the domain. And it's a service that continuously runs in the background. If you get onto any domain joined machine, and you list out the running processes, you're almost always going to see NetLogon there. The third one is SAMR, or Remote SAM. This provides management functionality for the domain account database, and it stores information about users and groups. The SAMR protocol is particularly interesting to attackers or pen testers because it can be used to perform like recon about the internal domain using tools such as Bloodhound, which are really cool, and you should also research if you're interested in attacking Active Directory. And lastly, there's the DRSU API, which stands for the Directory Replication Service remote protocol. The replication services are used for domain controllers to replicate information between them. So if we go back to the example that I gave before, where you have Gotham.io, and then Gotham.io has several subdomains, that top level domain needs to know the user information for all of its subdomains. And so that data is replicated to Gotham.io's domain controller using the directory replication service. Another fun note for anyone into security is that this interface can also be leveraged to perform what's called a DC sync attack. DC sync is an attack in which you basically replicate the replication traffic between domain controllers, and you trick a domain controller into sending you some data. Most commonly, you'll use it to retrieve password hashes from the domain controller, because domain controllers store the hash of every user in the domain in a file called ntds.dit, and you can use DC sync to retrieve hashes from there. And then you can leverage those in a bunch of different ways for further access, although if an attacker has the permissions required to pull off a DC sync attack, then they likely already own your domain. Lastly, we're going to talk about NTLM authentication. Like I mentioned before, this is the legacy authentication protocol. When Active Directory was first introduced back with Windows Server in, I think it was Windows Server 2000, the default authentication protocol was NTLM. We're not going to dive too deep into it, because like everything else, this gets super complicated really quickly. But basically, NTLM consists of two kinds of hash names, which are or hash formats. You have LM hashes and you have NTLM hashes. And then there are also two protocols, which are NTLM v1 and NTLM v2, which are the authentication protocols related to NTLM authentication. And of course, as always, NTLM being a legacy protocol is always vulnerable to certain attacks, most notably pass the hash, where if you recover a user's password hash, you can take that and convert it into access as the user without actually getting their clear text password. Okay, so now that we have a fundamental understanding of how Active Directory is built and the protocols that go into it, we can start talking about how it can be used to manage users and groups and all the various rights and privileges for each of them. So we start off with users. Users can be created as local accounts or domain accounts. Local accounts are user accounts that are stored only locally on that one machine, whereas domain accounts are part of the Active Directory domain. Some of the very important local accounts are number one, the administrator account. This is the first account that's created with any new Windows install. It has full control over almost every resource on the system. You can't delete it or lock it, but you can disable it or rename it. And starting with Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016, it's disabled by default, and a separate account in the local administrator group is created during setup. The other really important local account is the system account, otherwise known as NT Authority System. If anyone's worked with Linux, you can compare this to the root account on Linux. They're basically the same thing, except that NT Authority System isn't really a user account, it's a service account. But we don't need to get into that now. Pretty much all of the operating system processes run under system context. And NT Authority System has basically full control over everything on the operating system. Yeah, so like Raymond just mentioned in the chat, it is very important to have a local admin account, especially when you have a device that falls off the domain and needs to be reconnected to it. However, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because very often local admin accounts aren't managed properly, and they can become a very big risk in a domain for organizations, and they are very often a point of attack for attackers. And then the other kind of accounts we have, like I said, are domain accounts. The cool thing about domain accounts is that by default, every domain user can log on to any machine in the domain, unlike local accounts. And pretty much the most important domain account you need to worry about is the KRBTGT account. This is the service account for the key distribution center on the domain controller, the KDC, if you remember from when we were talking about Kerberos. If an attacker manages to gain the password hash for the KRBTGT account, it's basically game over. At that point, they will have unrestricted access to the domain, and it's commonly said that if the KRBTGT account is compromised, it would be easier to rebuild your entire Active Directory setup than it would be to actually secure the domain. So, yeah. We can also have domain joined and non-domain joined machines like we were just talking about. Obviously, non-domain joined machines are not going to be a part of the domain. The advantage of not being part of a domain, obviously, is that you can control everything that goes on in your machine. You can make whatever changes you want, and any user accounts that you make are only going to be stored locally on your computer and not anywhere else. The drawback is obviously that it's much harder to share data outside your local network. Whereas with domain joined machines, those domain joined hosts are going to acquire any configurations or changes that it needs through the domains group policy. It's much easier to share resources outside of your local network when you're joined to a domain. And like we said earlier, this is the setup you're most likely to see in enterprise environments. It's also important to note that before I was talking about the NT Authority System account, in an Active Directory environment, this account will usually have the same rights and privileges as a standard domain user account. And again, from a security perspective, this is important because it means that attackers don't always need to get user credentials to gain access to the domain. Instead, they can just compromise one of the machines, and then through a various different attacks, they can elevate their privileges to NT authority system, and then they can get access to the domain that way. Okay. We also have the concept of groups. Groups are another way of grouping different objects together. There are a bunch of built-in groups, and you can obviously define your own groups. The difference between groups and OUs is that groups are actually they're both considered AD objects, but you can assign rights and privileges to groups. And so members of that group will inherit the rights and privileges of that group. So, for example, if you had a group called, I don't know, that you called like admins, and then you put a bunch of users in it and you gave them that group privileges to have local admin access to any of the servers, then all the users within that group would have those rights and privileges. To make it even more complicated, you can put groups inside of groups, and you can have like groups inside groups, and then users inside that second group would inherit the properties, the rights and privileges, not only from the group they're in, but from the group that contains the group that they're in, if that makes any sense. And then lastly, no, not lastly, we're not done yet. We have, like I was saying, built-in versus custom groups. There are a lot of built-in groups that are created kind of when you set up the domain. So for example, you have like domain admins, which are the admins of the domain. You can actually only put users in these built-in groups. So you can't like nest groups inside of built-in groups, which is kind of Windows' way, which is Microsoft's way of forcing you to keep it less complicated. But like I was saying, it's also common for organizations to create, kind of their own additional groups. And on top of that, certain changes you make to your Active Directory environment are going to trigger the creation of even more groups. So the example I have here is when you add Microsoft Exchange to a domain, it's going to add various security groups that are responsible for managing the the mail service that Exchange provides. And then lastly, we have rights and privileges. These are the cornerstone of Active Directory management. And in general, rights and privileges are a pretty important topic in cybersecurity as a whole. And it's kind of important to understand the difference between the two. Rights are typically assigned to like a user or a group, and they deal with access. So when we talk about rights, we're talking about what a person has access to. So, for example, if it comes to reading a file, if we give a user access to read that specific file, we are giving that user the right to read that file. Privileges, on the other hand, grant a user permission to perform an action, such as run a program, or shut down a system, or reset passwords, or whatever. Privileges can also be assigned to groups like as a whole, or to individual users. And yeah, I think that's it. So I put together a list of resources if you're interested in learning some more about this stuff. So I kind of have two sections here. So at the top, we have kind of just general learn about Active Directory resources. This first one is a link to a Hack the Box Academy module that is absolutely fantastic. And if you're interested in learning about Active Directory and kind of how to configure it, and a little bit about how to secure it, I would highly recommend you check that out. And then I'm a hacker and red teamer, and so my expertise tends to lie in attacking Active Directory. And so I gave some resources here if you're interested in learning that as well. So that is it.
I see that Jake raised his hand, so if you just want to address the question that he has.
Yeah, what's up, Jake?
Yeah, so I was just gonna ask if you could explain from a very high level, like how does someone go about like configuring an Active Directory, like setting up the servers and like setting up all the permissions and stuff like that?
So it's kind of a complex process. If you are interested in learning that, um, definitely check out that first Hack the Box Academy module. They go through that pretty much in depth. Um, it kind of depends what you want to do. So your first step is going to be setting up your domain controller, which involves like installing Active Directory domain services on it. And then from there, you're configuring the users and the groups and the policies and all of that. And then if you have like bigger environments that you want to interact with, you would set up domain trusts. And yeah, does that kind of cover what you were looking for?
Yeah. Like I said, just from a high level perspective.
Yeah.
So,
I actually have a follow-up question on that. So from like a
Yeah, sure.
startup perspective, you're like a
Uh-huh.
small company and you kind of want to implement that Active Directory
Okay.
concept into it. Is this something that's popularly outsourced until you could get the, IT crew or like, support the Active Directory?
So most smaller companies or startups just don't use Active Directory, because you don't really feel the benefits of it until you're a bigger company. Because I think I mentioned it earlier, the biggest benefit to Active Directory is it gives you a centralized way to manage everything. And so when you don't have that many resources to manage, you don't feel the benefits of it as much, and it feels like more of a hassle. But in general, um, most companies do outsource the creation of their environments, um, or they'll hire someone to do it for them, which I guess is outsourcing in a way. But yeah, because it's so complicated, usually they won't do it themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Um,
Mhm.
just anybody else have any other questions before we fully wrap up here?
Yeah, actually. So, I actually have like I have like a very basic understanding of like what the purpose of Active Directory is in terms of permission and as well as rights. But going on that second point of rights, how does Active Directory sort of tie in or differ from, say, like VLANs?
That's a good question. So where where a VLAN is kind of like just a way of grouping together kind of a bunch of machines on a network, and allowing them to talk to each other. Um, Active Directory kind of goes like a step above that, and kind of builds in the user and group and permission management and all of that into the same centralized system. And so instead of having to set that all up after setting up your VLAN, that is a part of your Active Directory setup.
Yeah, so again, we're just gonna, if anybody else has any other questions, we're gonna start the wrap up here. I will be posting the attendance right now into the chat, so feel free to go ahead and fill out that Google form. And while you're doing that, also, I just want to give a big virtual round of applause. Let's see if this actually works. Uh, Try to do that. Yeah, big virtual round of applause for David right there. I think he did a wonderful job putting together this meeting. A lot of very useful information for learning about Active Directory in the first place, especially for everybody that is kind of getting their footing in the world of IT, cybersecurity. The resources at the end are very important as well. I definitely like the inclusion of attacking Active Directory because that speaks more. It's more of the cybersecurity side, and David being
Yeah.
the infamous red teamer that he is, um, definitely plays into his biggest strength. So again, thank you very much for everybody to attend today. We did record this meeting, so you'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel, and we'll let you know when that gets posted if you ever want to refer back to this meeting. And thank you everybody for coming by.
Thank you very much. Take care.